Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Quite a while back in episode 48, I think this is episode 145, perhaps, something like that. No, 144 today. So it's been almost 100 episodes since then, amazingly. I had one of my favorite episodes back when I interviewed Professor Mary Stanford. And the occasion of that was a great essay she had written for Homiletic and Pastoral Review dealing with Ephesians 5, namely the part where St. Paul talks about wives submitting to their husbands and husbands loving their wives as Christ loves the church, and how to view that, particularly in light of theology of the body. And since then, she has written a book on the topic, published by Our Sunday Visitor, titled The Obedience Paradox: Finding True Freedom in Marriage. So I'm really excited to bring Mary back on to talk about this yet again in greater depth. Welcome back to the show, Mary.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Am I understanding correctly that the interview we did actually sort of was the seed of this book?
It really did precipitate the project. I received a call or an email within a couple weeks of doing the podcast from a senior editor at Our Sunday Visitor. And she said, we would love, she mentioned that she was really touched by the podcast and would I be willing to do a book for them? And that's actually something that had been suggested before after I had given some talks on this topic, but I never felt in any way sort of equipped or just able, given all of my other responsibilities in life, to do something like that. But this time the timing was just better. And in my mind, I thought, well, if I did write a book, I think this is what I would say. And it just sort of, I presented a little outline and it got approved, and here we are.
Yeah, well, I was really happy to hear about the book because I think this is your perspective on this is very valuable. I've never quite seen anybody put it together like you do, both in terms of truth and also palatability. You've been teaching theology of the body at Christendom College for a number of years and discussing this topic. Is this your first book?
This is, yes. Other than a few essays and articles, this is definitely my first book. And again,
wow, congratulations!
Had it not come to me,
that's amazing.
Thank you. It was not something that I ever thought could be done. And while I have 7 children and I homeschool my younger ones, and it just didn't. My teaching at Christendom is wonderful, but that does take a lot even to pull that off. And so,
right,
So this just, it seemed like God was opening all the doors for this to be the right time, the timing.
Wonderful.
Together.
Okay, so let's jump into it. Now, you started this book with an interesting claim that obedience is sort of at the core of what it means to be a person. So you started with a very big picture, rather than starting talking about marriage. You talked about obedience itself.
Yes, and that was one of the things too that I felt I needed to do, because when I talked to my editor, Mary Beth Giltner, she said that she was very touched by the podcast because she received some insights that sort of affected her whole understanding of obedience, even in her mind, obedience in the religious life and just in the spiritual life in general. And so I realized that if I was going to do this book, while it was going to focus on the specifics of the relationship between husband and wife, because the relationship of Christ and the church is one that has been compared to a marriage, right? That we all have something to learn about obedience, specifically from the way in which a husband and wife live that dynamic. And so that's why I thought I wanted to start out in general and then kind of go into the specifics and see what insights we could gain there, and kind of then pan back out again at the end.
Right, because the idea of authority and obedience, that's just a problematic topic in general now. And even within the church, people struggle with it in dealing with, church disciplines they disagree with, for instance. That's like a very active topic at the moment. And then in the political realm, it takes on a whole other, scale. It's interesting because you'd think it would be easier for people to accept the idea of obedience in marriage, where it's a relationship that's freely entered into, whereas you're born into a political society and you don't really, your consent, to the social contract doesn't really matter,
Yeah.
in that
No,
sense.
interesting. Yes. Yes.
But yeah.
Yeah.
So why is it, why is obedience so important to understanding personhood?
I think because, again, today it's become sort of obedience, authority. Those words have become sort of like poison, sort of topic words that, toxic words that sort of get a reaction from people. And I was sort of trying to analyze why. And it seems in my mind that obedience is usually associated with a lack of freedom. Obedience is contrasted to freedom. We say, we think of obedience as something where your freedom is taken from you because someone else is sort of ordering you around or living for you. And I wanted to sort of examine the idea that, we do use the word obedience, with our pets, doggy obedience school. We talk about the planets, sort of, they obey the laws of nature. We talk about or shall I say subhuman creatures that don't have personal spiritual abilities to understand and to choose. We use that word when we're talking about animals, but the truth is an animal can't actually disobey any more than it can obey. Animals follow instinct. Animals respond to stimuli. If an animal behaves badly, so to speak, we usually don't blame the animal. We blame the owner. Somehow the owner put it in a situation where something was triggered. We don't assign agency and responsibility to a non-personal creature. So it made me realize, wait a minute. Strictly speaking, non-free creatures can't obey any more than they can really disobey. We train them, we condition them, which means, well, wait a minute. If only personal creatures can obey, it seems to be something that must have some dignity. And so that sort of forced me to consider, in what way does obedience express sort of the highest form of what we can do? And again, my book puts authority and submission, it looks at it through the lens of giving and receiving. Okay, and we can talk more about that as the interview goes on, but in that context, when we think about the giving and the receiving of a gift, a lot of times, even as Catholics, we talk about, how noble it is to give, charity, this, that. But the truth is, there is no gift without an offering, a free offering, yes, but also a free reception. It's, it's a gift is lost if it's not it's not complete. It's not a success if it isn't freely received. And so if authority ultimately, in the best, most authentic sense, is a kind of sacrificial gift that serves the whole, then there has to be some element in obedience, which is the receiving of this thing and the disposition required for the receiver of a gift. And the ability to freely recognize when something is being offered and to freely accept it. And of course, we're humans. We know that when a gift is offered, it's not just an item. It is a relationship being offered with the other person. And so to receive a gift from another is a really big deal, actually. And only a person can do this. Only a person can recognize the significance of a gift. And only a person can freely enter into a relationship. You can't really be forced into a relationship. So that sort of was the avenue that I went down in examining the way in which obedience is actually a truly and exclusively personal act.
What's interesting about looking at the fall of Adam and Eve is that it both tells us a lot about obedience and disobedience in relationship to God, but also about the relationship between the spouses. And it seems like this problem begins with Eve's unwillingness to trust that God is a giver, that God's commands are part of his gift, rather than something that he's trying to take or keep from her.
Exactly. That it's precisely that moment where Eve is tempted by the devil. He makes the suggestion that God, in giving them their lives, this beautiful garden, everything that surrounds them, including a commandment that is offered for their protection, because of course he says, do not eat of that tree or you will die. He suggests that no, God is not offering that for their flourishing, for their protection. He's not a giver. That won't happen. You won't die, right? He is actually trying to keep something from you in order to manipulate you. And so she has to make a choice. Do I trust God? She hasn't been given any reasons not to trust God, but that's the suggestion. Do I trust or do I doubt? And that's really the crux of the disposition that's necessary to receive a gift. It is trust. You're trusting that this other person is offering you something that is for your good, that is out of love. And in accepting it, you're accepting this relationship, this union with them. And so that disposition of trust is huge, and it's very scary. We're all very vulnerable, right? Because of course, in the human world, our trust is broken a lot, right? People have experienced their trust being broken, and it's deeply wounding to the human person. So that sort of stands at the beginning, that if you were going to have relationships, if we're going to have union, if we're going to have community between persons, it absolutely needs to be free, and therefore it requires this element of trust. And of course, we know the story that she opted to doubt and to really refuse the gift, refuse to be a receiver, and Adam, of course, joining her in that.
Do you think that part of the reason that Adam falls and goes along with Eve is precisely because his natural disposition is to be a giver? And in this case, she asks for something that he shouldn't be giving, but in order not to be separated from her, he chooses to disobey God and give her the things that she asks. So he's giving, but without sort of reference to a higher authority.
That's interesting. People have sort of speculated on, where was Adam? Why did he leave her alone?
Right,
or
right.
Why does he sort of go along? And I don't know. I haven't thought too much about that specifically. I think that at the very least, we know that Eve, in her beauty and in her being, certainly exerts a certain power over Adam, right? This attractive power that he wants to sort of do what she does. And she has the capacity to lead him actually where he ought not to go. So there is
Right.
the sense in which...
Even without concupiscence.
Even without concupiscence, and,
Right.
and in that moment, of course, when we talk about Adam and Eve without concupiscence, that's often why it's suggested that the temptation to Eve had to sort of it didn't really come from within her heart. It comes from an exterior source, Satan tempting her. But once she's already eaten, right, perhaps then she's able to sort of be a source of temptation for him. But nonetheless, it's a testament to the fact that that the beauty and of women, the natural attraction that men and women are going to have to one another is probably plays a part in that.
The other thing is that Eve's distrust of God ends up becoming sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy about her relationship with man.
Yes, and that's the thing, that she doesn't want God to control and manipulate her. She has misinterpreted his gift, which is for her flourishing. She's misinterpreted as an attempt to control and manipulate. But then unfortunately, in this new state, when Adam and Eve have basically severed themselves from God's friendship, they no longer have the vision of one another that they once had. I do spend a lot of time in the book talking about the original vision when Adam and Eve behold one another naked without shame, which is sort of a mysterious concept for us in this post-fallen world. But nonetheless, what John Paul suggests is that they are viewing one another in a sense through the eyes of God. They're so close, they're in such intimacy with God that they see what he sees, and they see one another in the full value. They see one another as God sees them. And so there's no shame. Their bodies completely reveal sort of their inner dimensions, and it's like a beautiful mutual exchange of gift of Adam and Eve, one before the other. But then, of course, the first thing that happens after they've severed themselves from God's friendship through their own choice is this new experience of the body. Suddenly they're seeing one another's bodies. Even to say, oh, I see your body, is sort of to distinguish that body from you in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a new experience. And not only are they noticing one another's bodies, they're hiding one another's bodies from each other. They're hiding with the fig leaves, and they're hiding in the bushes, actually, from God. So all of this new experience is associated with the fact that they're experiencing a new vulnerability with regard to the other. And there is a certain fear that the other might try to use or control me.
Right.
And certainly what we see in the sad history of men and women, we hear God say, your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And, some people talk about that line, and I've even had over the years students debate whether that line is what they would say is descriptive. Is it describing the new dynamic between them? Or is it prescriptive? Is it somehow saying this is the new rule for male-female relations, and they want to connect that to wives, be submissive to your husbands? And I would disagree with that. I'd say it's descriptive of what's going on between them now. Her desire for him, her desire for union is very strong, but it's so strong that she's even tempted to allow him to objectify her. Okay, and he's going to be tempted to rule over her in the sense that he might relate to creation as more of an object. That's not the same thing as the headship that St. Paul talks about.
Right.
So it is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that here woman in history many times has been sort of objectified, used for man's pleasure. But at the same time, it was what she was trying to avoid in the first place, and she walks right into it. So that's sort of part of the sadness of that.
We've also seen that in modern history too, like sort of like the pride of women in wanting to be liberated in a certain sense, and that actually then leads to greater objectification and greater slavery to men. We
liberate ourselves right into, I'll do anything for you. I will ruin my physical health, my psychological wholeness. I'll give away everything just so I can be free and allow you to use me and not have to commit to me. I mean, it's so sad. But again, it goes with that desire. And that's something that I do talk about in the middle chapters of the book, the way in which woman in a particular way seeks affirmation in and through relationships. And it's not that men aren't also ordered toward relationship, but woman craving the person in a particular way. It's natural, but it's so strong that sometimes she's willing to, again, I would describe it by that line, your desire shall be for your husband. She's driven by a desire for fulfillment through relationship in such a strong way that sometimes she's willing to not actually see herself as more than an object. And one thing I just wanted to mention, and I wish I put it in the book, but I read it after I wrote the book. There's a scholar on John Paul's theology of the body, Deborah Savage. I don't know if you've read anything by her. But she makes a point that in Eden, in those moments before Eve is even created, Adam is alone, right? And God said it's not good that man should be alone, so he's sort of seeking a suitable companion. He's presented with all of the animals. He's observing them. He's naming them, right? He's sort of analyzing them. He's among objects, and he's relating to the thing, as it were. When Eve is created, and of course he's presented with her, he realizes, okay, here's a fellow person, a fellow human being. The possibility of communion is on the horizon. But she makes the point that when Eve is created, from the first moment of her creation, she's always in relationship with another human person. She didn't have a time when she was alone. So she just makes this distinction between the sort of orientation of man in a way toward the object, toward the thing, which I talk about in the book. But that woman from the beginning was in relationship. So that's just how much that means to her in defining herself. And we have to be careful because that can get in it can go in a dangerous direction.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. How does the gospel reveal equality between men and women? And in what sense does that word equality need to be specified or qualified?
Oh, that's a good question. We look at the ways in which Jesus deals with women, the way he speaks with women, the way he speaks with sinners, women that were considered women that you shouldn't even talk to or go near, right? The woman at the well, Mary Magdalene, the way he relates to Martha and Mary, the way he when he says, he who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart, right? Adultery for the Jews a lot of times was seen more as a violation of someone else's property, right? You steal somebody else's wife, that's his wife, that's his property. You shouldn't be with her. So he restores and deepens the meaning of that commandment against adultery to say, no, you shouldn't be looking at a woman in that way, right? So it's a restoring of her dignity. And certainly, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither male nor female. St. Paul echoing the fact that salvation is for everyone, and with him there's just there is no distinction in terms of who is fit for union with God. And so again, we are equal in that way, but of course we now hear the word equality, and oftentimes it's reduced to sameness, identicalness. I know that's not really a word, but identicalness. When two things are identical, you lose so much, of course. One of the concepts that I talk about in the book is the concept of asymmetry. And I think Jesus is using examples again and again in his teachings about the conditions necessary for the bearing of fruit. And he talks about there has to be, a union of seed with good soil. Seed and soil are non-identical things, right? But unless these two different things come into receptive union, there will be no fruit. A branch with the vine, unless they're in union, there will be no fruit. And so these examples from just sort of organic reality, we see that there cannot be a union unless there are two distinct, non-identical elements. There is the generous element and the receptive element. It corresponds to the elements necessary for a gift. You cannot have a union with someone else without a voluntary offering and a voluntary reception. And so you simply can't have union without that between ourselves and God. And again, Adam and Eve didn't have that trust, and they didn't have that vulnerability. They were afraid. They were put off by the vulnerability required in actually saying yes to what God was offering them. And so I think that when we talk about equality, we have to talk about the fact that no, we are all created for union with the divine. But equality doesn't mean sameness. And even the fact that when St. Paul is saying, there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, that's sort of acknowledging that there's going to be a lot of difference out there. Okay. Not that we want to continue with slavery or anything, but just acknowledging people where they are. Nope. Everybody is fit for union with God. Everyone is capacitated for union with God. And so trying to understand that equality doesn't mean sameness. And sameness is just going to lead to sort of solitariness. You can't have communion unless you have differentiation, unless you have asymmetry. Those are the elements required for true union.
Yeah, it seems like a very Protestant idea that equality in capacity for union with Christ means that we don't make any distinctions between persons, including in matters of authority. But let me play devil's advocate and ask, well, what about friendship? I mean, friendship, sure, there's giving, there's receiving, there has, but one isn't always, the giver, and one isn't always the receiver. So, isn't that a sort of communion? Why can't marriage be like that?
Interesting. I'm thinking off the cuff because that one hasn't been proposed to me before. Yes, there's definitely mutual giving and receiving in friendships. And as I point out in the book, there is mutual giving and receiving between spouses. It's just that at the most fundamental level, what we have to look at it is we can have multiple friendships, right? And sometimes friendships wane and they wax, but we can maintain many friendships. As a matter of fact, probably the reason we are somewhat limited in our friendships is simply because of space and time, right?
Right.
The more the merrier, actually, with friends, except that we're limited by space and time, and in heaven we won't be. But marriage, again, mirroring, being a reflection of the relation of Christ and the church, is an exclusive. It's an exclusive union par excellence. And because you don't get married to multiple people, right? This is a relationship which is a reflection of the exclusivity that we have between ourselves and God. Of course, God is infinite, so he doesn't have to be exclusive, but so it's not the more the merrier, right? It's three's company, or two's company, three's a crowd. Sorry, three's company. Bad reference. Because the particular kind of union that marriage is, right? The two become one flesh. That's what our Lord tells us, right? It says so in Genesis, and then Jesus quotes Genesis, right? The two shall become one flesh. And to say one flesh, it's a true oneness. And of course, that oneness is then sort of made visible in the child, right? And you realize that this is not just any kind of union, right? This isn't just, friendships can be super deep, they can be light, they can, like I said, there can be sort of a variety. But within marriage, this is an exclusive union. And this union is one which is actually going to be the formative atmosphere for this child that's actually going to reveal God to this child. Now, I know that puts a lot of pressure on marriage, but nonetheless, so this union has to be sort of, it's very particular. And so this dynamic of giving and receiving, while again, as I talk about in the book, a woman does give to her husband. She gives, but often her generosity is precisely in receiving well what he does for her. Because a woman can do many, many nice concrete gestures for her husband, but unless she is also simultaneously receiving what he does in an appreciative, grateful, respectful, however you want to say it, way, there's not going to be unity in that marriage. There's going to be tension, and there's going to be resentment. There's going to be unhappiness. So I think because of the one flesh union, that it is the union par excellence that mirrors God to world, and in particular the children who grow up in that family, that it really is important that we love, I guess, according to our gender. But again, when it comes to other friendships in life, right, a lot of them are same-sex friendships, right? When it comes to the relationship between man and woman, the deepest form of friendship between them, I think it requires this generosity and receptivity. But again, it doesn't mean women aren't generous and men aren't receptive, but the primary mode is such that a woman can give all sorts of things to her husband, but the union won't be there unless he receives him in a particular way.
I see. Now, in the New Testament, St. Peter and St. Paul both repeatedly urge wives to obey their husbands. And, they're of course, the most thorough, the most beautiful, the most frequently cited passage is Ephesians 5, where St. Paul says, husbands, you love your wives as Christ loves the church, and this self-sacrificial reference of the cross. But there's other places where they just say, wives, obey your husbands, and they don't even mention, husbands, love your wives as wives love the church. As Christ loved the church. And there is a sense that among some people that, well, St. Peter and St. Paul were just using the language of their time, or they were just conceding to the fallen customs of the age. Why is that not the case?
Well, again, a couple things. I think that sometimes the test of things is time, and the church throughout its history, and I quote several popes in the book, looking at these passages and saying, no, husbands, you got to love your wives in a sacrificial manner and be the head of the family, be the head of the wife. And wives, be submissive, obey, don't obey in a way that is below your dignity. They don't always specify what that means, but they do say that. And so they've looked at it throughout history and interpreted it through the church's tradition as that there is a principle of authority within marriage. In terms of being a product of the culture, the early Christians were often known for being countercultural. They were the ones that, wouldn't, didn't believe in killing babies, didn't, refuse to eat the sacrificed meats. There was plenty of things that sort of set apart the Christians. They weren't afraid to be countercultural. So I'd say, that argument doesn't hold too much for me. But the bigger one, I think, is simply that throughout time, what the church in her teaching authority and her magisterium has taken from these scriptural passages and handed down through time is one which very assertively states that there is and needs to be a principle, I'd call it a principle of unity within the family, which includes this principle made possible by having a principle of authority.
Yeah, I think even I think in one of his allocutions to newlyweds, Pius XII even suggested, if I'm remembering correctly, that St. Paul was not talking to, he was not just reinforcing the custom of the time, because actually the people who, according to his historical claim in this allocution, is that the people he was writing to, I forget if it was the Ephesians or maybe the Corinthians or whoever it was, there was actually sort of a proto, what we might call as like liberated women in that time. And he wasn't just reinforcing and transforming what was a previous relationship of headship and obedience. He was also just restoring on the natural level that
what you were seeing. And actually, that's true. You do hear of those things, definitely, especially as the Roman Empire began to fall apart, was marriage and families were actually a mess. Women were leaving their families. Yes.
So it might not even be the case that was the prevalent custom, among all of the people that St. Paul was writing to. But obviously that's, people can agree or disagree on, historical claims, even in papal writings, of that nature. But it's just interesting.
Yeah.
Another thing that people say is sort of, well, this headship and obedience, this is a consequence, sort of the converse of what you were saying. Some of your students suggested that this is the consequence of the fall. Like the basic structure of headship and obedience, or at least of, authority and obedience, is a consequence of the fall. And it's something to be sort of ameliorated as much as possible. Like we should get away from thinking of it that way as much as possible. For example, and, I don't know to what degree she would agree with that sort of example that I just laid out. But in Abigail Favali's new book on gender, the Genesis of Gender, she at one point she says there's no sense of hierarchy before the fall in the Genesis account. And I guess you could, I don't know exactly what she means by hierarchy, right? Because she could mean like a hierarchy of value or something like that. But it's just interesting to me that in Cassi Canubi, Pope Pius XI, he actually, I think he uses the words, the order of love. I think you quoted that in the book. He says that this relationship of authority and obedience are part of the order of love, which to me is a pretty clear sign that this is not just a result of fallen human nature, like, having to work in a sort of tiresome way.
Right. And I think, again, the words of Genesis are sparse, right? And so in terms of, how the relationship would have looked pre-fall. What we do know was that in that relationship, because when the one looked upon the other and there was no shame, to me that communicates what was experienced before the fall was union. Okay, and we don't have all of the pieces of the puzzle to explain why was that perfect union, that truly one flesh unit, why was that possible? Okay, but what we also see before the fall is, again, God's power, God's authority is established in and through the gift of creation. He is giving them their lives, their existence, this beautiful world, every good thing to eat, a mission, So God is establishing his authority. He is the source. That's what the word authority means. He is the source of everything, and it is all good, right? And so when he does make this first covenant with Adam and Eve, you shall eat of every tree that's good for food, but don't eat this tree, right? And so they have no reason to not trust that he's good, because he has established himself as giver. So I still think that we see a a true expression of what authority is in God the Creator. Okay.
Right.
And then, of course, fast forward, even before we get to Ephesians 5, Jesus at the Last Supper, right? The washing of the feet. He
Right.
is showing them an example. He says, if you want to be like me, this is what you got to do, right? He is their leader, right? And how does he relate to them? He's washing their feet. He's serving, okay? The leader as someone that gives and serves. And so
Right.
to me, it's actually not a new form of leadership. It's just hearkening back to the original form of authority that we see with God in the garden, that God absolutely is establishing himself, his power. He's displaying his power through gift. So the specifics of how Adam and Eve are relating is, like I said, the words are very sparse. But what we see is that they have union. They have union, and then that union is broken, and we see the new distorted relationship between them is one of sort of neediness on the woman's part and a kind of use and domination on the man's part. So we see that does not bring union. Okay, so now fast forward to Ephesians 5, we have husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, right? How did he love the church, right? Laid down his life for her. Okay, and so for wives to be submissive to that, to me means nothing other than to receive and accept well what he is offering you. So I think that while it's not laid out super specifically before the fall, there's no reason to believe that the dynamic of giving and receiving between man and wife is that which would establish their union is somehow not there, because I think that it is. And then, of course, the whole middle part of the book, when I talk about the insights that St. Eva Stein and others have given us into the different ways in which man and woman sort of see themselves, the way in which they each have a distinct sense of sexual identity, absolutely sort of disposes them for this dynamic of being affirmed through the giving and receiving dynamic. So I think to say that there was no authority structure before the fall, you can say there was no sort of dominating power use structure, but that's kind of a bastardization of authority. I don't think that that's what authority actually means. Jesus makes it clear, and I think if you go all the way back to the beginning, we see, no, that's exactly what Adam and Eve were afraid to trust. They were afraid to trust that God was loving them and everything that he had offered to them. And actually, one more thing. Throughout the covenants of the Old Testament, in particular before the covenant at Mount Sinai, God would always, before inviting them into a covenant of trust with the chosen people, he would say things like, right, I am the Lord your God, the one who led you out of the land of Egypt. I led you out of slavery in Egypt. He would often remind them of all the good that he had done, the gifts that he had given them, before inviting them to trust in a new covenant. So to me, again and again, he establishes his authority by reminding them, I love you. I give you things. Look at what I've given you. You always forget, and so again and again, even there, we see that no, the image of God is not this controlling, manipulative God. That's what Eve was afraid of. That fear was what the devil preyed on. But I think that if you look at all of those pieces, that there's no reason, the structure of love, so to speak, requires asymmetry. And anyway, so I think that the argument can be made that the original, that of course there would have been that dynamic between Adam and Eve, but it was lived so perfectly. They just had this one flesh union and no shame. And it was just, we sort of saw we saw what union looked like there. We just didn't quite, it's not quite spelled out about how it was achieved.
Right. So another approach that I often see is people will handle Ephesians 5 by emphasizing the sacrificial aspect of headship. And you see that even, I believe, in the gospel reading, you're allowed to bracket out the part about what women are supposed to do in that passage, I think, in the official liturgy, you're allowed to leave that part out, which could really end up giving the impression that men have duties and obligations and women do not, which is kind of an absurd, bizarre situation to create. So you could say, yes, well, how do you define headship? Headship is a giver. Headship is he's a sacrificer. But it's servant headship, right? But you can't do that in a way that would lose the paradoxical element of it, because a head is not merely a servant. In other words, a husband does not exercise his authority by acting literally like a servant would, where he takes no initiative and is just told what to do, so there's still the need, as you say explicitly in the book, it still doesn't let us off the hook. Explaining headship in this way doesn't let us off the hook from explaining what submission means, what obedience means.
But on that note, in terms of sort of what a head looks like, right? One of the huge things that I talk about in the book is the element of risk. Okay, when you offer a gift to someone, you take a huge risk, right? A risk that it's going to be rejected, not received well, whatever, right? Honestly, for a man to say, I just don't think that's good for our daughter, or I don't think this place to live is good for our family. When it's a decision that's serving the family's good, and he is going to say, I think I see this problem and I'm going to try to solve it, right? I'm going to make an effort to do X. It's a risk. It's a huge risk. And the thing is, are they always going to get it right? There's going to, of course, you talk about things with your wife back and forth. You do trust each other. You listen to each other, and we got to work at doing that. But when it comes down to those times when we want fathers to be a man, step up, engage, lead this family, well, guess what? That's really risky, and it's hard. And sometimes he might not quite get it right. And that's precisely where our submission saves the unity of the family. Because the point is to try to preserve this unity. And so, no, there's no guarantee that a man is in his perfect logical nature and all of these things that he's going to always get it right, that every effort on behalf of the family, even if it is sacrificial, is going to sort of pan out the way he hoped, right? And so that's why I think it's really important to explore the elements of submission. What does that look like? Does it mean we always have to be happy with everything and never have a conversation with our husband about this or that isn't working? No. But one gift that women have that, again, I was really led to this through St. Teresa Benedicta, Edith Stein, is that because women have such a close, I hate to say relationship, but our bodies are always reminding us that we're women, okay, in a way that's constant, that our bodies almost reveal to us that we are women, and you don't see women running around trying to prove that they're women, okay, where you might see guys running around trying to prove that they're a guy and win this and do that and accomplish this. Women, basically, I'd say we identify with our bodies in a certain way. It's a way that can be dangerous. But what's good about it is when you look at men's bodies, though they are, masculine in structure, they don't convince, a 15-year-old boy that he's a man, right? He needs to get a sense of his manhood through what he does with that body. He tends to see his body as more of an instrument. So he tries to score that touchdown, win that debate, shoot that deer. He tries to accomplish something. And then when that thing that he does is recognized and appreciated, he feels appreciated, which means he identifies with his deeds, with his work, in a way that is distinct from a woman who tends to identify with her body. But what gift this gives women is it's easier for us to separate our love for my husband than for what he did. Okay, I can say, okay, so you failed at this. I still love you. You're still you. You're not defined by that failure. Okay? And we can say this to our kids. Okay, you failed that test, or you had this disappointment, or you did this big screw up. Women have a gift of being able to distinguish who a person is from what they do. Now, again, you can't take that distinction too far because that's dangerous. But, it really is dangerous. You'll see mothers of death row inmates being like, "That's my baby. He didn't do it." We have to, but in the middle somewhere is a gift. And so because we can more easily sort of distance ourselves from, okay, maybe I don't think my husband's call in this situation, which I'm submitting to, is the best, but I'm going to get on board with it. And then he's not alone in it. And if it fails, he's not going to be crushed in it. I'm there with him, and that's going to give him the support and the encouragement to get up and do it all over again tomorrow, because that is the risk that the giver takes. When you give and that thing is not received, you're crushed by it. Okay, a man identifies more with his deeds. So what he's doing for his wife and family, if those things aren't received well, he feels that he's not being received well. So because we have this gift of being able to sort of distinguish him from what he does, that's a tremendous gift, and we have to employ that in our submission. And again, I gave an example of submitting in kind of a big way, where there's these big decisions that happen in family life, and that does not happen every day. I mean, I hope it doesn't happen every day. The little everyday submission of appreciating him and appreciating what he does and not sort of criticizing every little thing, that can be much harder for some women than the sort of occasional final say decision. But nonetheless, if we're going to ask him to be making these sacrifices and to be this big hero leader, we have to let him, and we have to get on board with it. And that, again, that is also not easy. And so I'm trying in the book to talk in, I hope, a way that is equally challenging / encouraging for husbands and wives, to try to look at the everyday ways in which they can do what they're called to do better. Because if they do, they're actually both going to feel more satisfied and more personally affirmed in the process.
There's often a this is sort of building on what you've been saying, but you often see in the New Testament and the different counsels that are given to men and women, or husbands and wives, they are obviously all the virtues apply, right, to both men and women, but in different, you might say in different modes, perhaps. But you do see consistently different counsels given by the epistle writers of the New Testament. It's interesting to think about the fact that that husbands and wives might be living the same virtues in different ways. So in Cassi Canubi, Pope Pius XI, he's talking about authority and obedience in marriage, and he qualifies this idea of subjection of the wife. He says it doesn't take away her liberty, her dignity as a human person. It doesn't mean that she has to obey every request of her husband if it's not in harmony with right reason or with her dignity. It doesn't mean that she should be treated as a minor, because as somebody who doesn't have mature judgment. But then he says but it forbids that exaggerated liberty which cares not for the good of the family. It forbids that in this body, which is the family, the heart be separated from the head, to the great detriment of the whole body and the proximate danger of ruin. And this is the part that I want to emphasize here. He says, for if the man is the head, the woman is the heart, and as he occupies the chief place in ruling, so she may and ought to claim for herself the chief place in love. And so that's another interesting example of that asymmetry that you talk about. And I know that you've talked about these sort of different modalities of love and marriage, but I'd like to go into that a little bit more. Like, why is it that love, expresses itself in these different ways, and respect? Because women are told often in the New Testament to respect their husbands, but of course the husband is supposed to respect his wife as well. So why is it that we shouldn't just sort of flatten in the way that people often want to and just say, yes, of course, they're both supposed to love and respect each other, because that's how Christians are supposed to relate to each other.
Right.
And why is it that it's sort of one aspect is emphasized?
Yeah. And I think, again, synonyms can help here. If a man tends to identify, and again, there's dangers in over-identifying with your work. There's truth in identifying with your body and identifying with your work. The ultimate truth is somewhere in between, but women have that emphasis in identifying more with our body and man with his work. So if he does identify with his work, when what he does, is respected, when it's appreciated, and that word appreciated, I always connect with gratitude. When someone receives it well, right? Freely receives it well. When that happens, the man feels affirmed. And it was kind of a breakthrough for me to realize, wait a minute, when a man is respected, that's how he experiences love. I think women, we make more of a distinction. I do deserve respect and great, but we tend to distinguish it from love because women tend to crave love in the form of a gift. We crave the person, the relationship. We want the gift of the person. So the fact that bodily we're sort of geared toward receptivity, spiritual we want to receive. So I need signs of that, right? Whether it's loving words and a date or flowers and, whatever my love language is, right? It tends to be receptive in nature. And so there is, and again, when I mentioned that about the thing about respect, a man will always think that he needs to earn the respect, right? He's got to do something that earns the respect. But women don't. Like, as a matter of fact, like when I tell my daughters, here, you got to demand respect, right? You don't usually hear guys going around demanding respect. They're trying to do something that sort of earns it, that gains them respect. Whereas women, we say, hey, respect yourself, because if you respect yourself, he's going to take that cue and think, oh, she values herself. Oh, I will value her too. So even the way that we talk about respect with women is different. And that's actually something I'd like to look into further. But for the moment, I'd say, to talk about the concept of respect for a guy, when he experiences respect, he feels loved. That's not the same. A woman doesn't just want to experience respect. She does, but she wants the gift of the person. When she's given something, when she is receiving, she feels loved. And so the fact that we understand, the different ways in which we operate as the masculine and the feminine, it's just not going to look the same on both sides. And again, when you talked about the family, sort of the man being the head, woman being the heart, I'm reminded of something, and this is terrible, speaking of paraphrasing. There was a study written, I think this was probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, so I'm not quoting who these researchers were, but it was a book from a group of people that call themselves difference feminists. Are you familiar with this, Thomas? Like, calling themselves feminists, but willing to recognize like a difference. We're not identical. And there was some sort of study done where there were kids at play, and they found that schoolboys were able to sustain a game with a finite set of rules at recess for a super long time. They just kept following the rules and they played for a long time. They found that girls were not able to sustain a game with rules for all that long. Why? They were constantly adjusting and breaking the rules because, well, so-and-so got his feelings hurt, so we're going to give him another turn. We're going to give her another turn at bat. Or this person, she's being mean. Let's let the other girl have another try. Like it was in the name of sort of righting wrongs. And what the study ended up saying was that, well, the boys seemed to have what they called an ethics of justice, sort of directing the way they played the game. And women displayed what they called an ethics of care, because they were breaking the rules because it had to do with people's feelings and caring about how people felt. My issue is, in the end, they concluded that the ethics of care was superior to the ethics of justice. When actually, what we need is both. Oh my goodness, right? If we didn't have a sense of justice and order, what that would do, right? Our feelings, and you can see disaster on both sides. We need both. But to me, that sort of reflected, there is a certain tenderness to people and their feelings that women have. We have a sensitivity. We can read faces better. We can intuit things. Sometimes our kids don't even have to explain something to us, and we kind of get it. And those are some sort of feminine gifts that we have and that we can bring into the home. In terms of the overall sort of tenderness, but it's useless without that overall structure of justice and structure of order that the masculine perspective brings. And so we need both. And again, coming back to the fact that it's all about this union, preserving the unity of this family. I once had a student say something after we were talking about some of these things in my class, and she said something about, so women have to submit to men. And I said, wait a minute. Wives are called to submit to their husbands. It's not like every man and every woman, oh, I'm going to submit to you. It's not that. It's
Right.
the attitudes that support the unity of this relationship, right? The sacrifice and the receptivity that is required for this union, right? Certainly being aware of the gifts and strengths of the other sexes can help in our friendships and our business relationships, understanding why men seem to react badly to this or women seem to react badly to it. Like, that's good. But it's in virtue of the union. It's always about being a part of something beyond yourself that includes you, but also extends beyond you, that these dispositions are required to sustain.
Though I do think there is a study to be made of how these things play out in in maybe a less pronounced way just in the world at large, how these differences play out, not in terms of a strict like authority obedience relationship, but we see that even in like religious orders, the charisms of male and female religious orders, for instance. So that would be
definitely, and that's what I'm saying.
Interesting,
like,
a whole
an
other
awareness
discussion
of
to open.
Some things. I once worked for an all-female organization, and we had really, really, really long meetings. And they kind of wandered. Okay, so we used to sometimes laugh, but like I said, keeping aware, or having an awareness of sometimes the things that tend to be in general sort of important or priorities of the opposite sex, that's only going to, I think, help our relationships in society. Absolutely.
Right. A lot of people talk about headship as like something to be suspicious of, even talking about like Catholics would be, okay, yes, the husband is the head, but they wouldn't want to emphasize that all. They're uncomfortable talking about it. They're comfortable sort of embracing it or submitting to it, in the sense that if it's your vocation given to you by God as a husband and father, then it's something that actually requires your obedience. But you talked in the book about how a lot of husbands today are more inclined to abdicate that headship. And you gave a wonderful example, because I just finished rereading Pride and Prejudice for the first time since high school, which has just been a delight. But the character of Mr. Bennet, who basically, he has abdicated his headship, and he's also just sort of, it really connects with your discussion of headship as being a risk, because to a large extent what he's doing is insulating himself from the pain of having entered into an imprudent marriage,
Yes.
and from the silliness of his daughters and his wife. And he just sort of retreats, and he has a certain contempt for them, but nor is he, lording it over them either. He's not really exercising his authority properly at all. He's just sort of neglecting them and allowing them to do what they want, and it ends up in disaster. So I think he is a great example that you brought up in the book of the abdication of headship, and how that is connected with the unwillingness to be vulnerable and face risk, because we see both of those in him.
It is. It just, again, being married to an English professor is super fun, because he gave me another example last night that I wished I'd used in the book. But I'm telling you, it's even the physical way in which Mr. Bennet retreats to his study, right? It is a retreat. And that line, there will be no peace at Longbourn if we don't let Lydia go on this trip to Brighton. If we're always making decisions about peace, what will stop the complaints, what will stop the grumbling, that's not going to be, if that is what's motivating our decisions, ultimately it's going to motivate non-decisions. It's going to motivate retreat and not engaging, and ultimately abdicating. And then when things go south, it's not just the sadness that, oh, maybe he could have stopped that bad thing from happening, but what happens to that relationship? Husband and wife are driven further apart, even if, because again, if it's possible that Mr. Bennet could have stepped in and made an edict and said, no, you can't go. And And maybe that daughter still would have gone off the deep end, right? But at least they would have known, he would have known that he spoke up, he stepped up, right? And so in terms of the marriage, so I was trying to look at what happens to the marriage when one refuses to take the risk. The wife is not fulfilled either. She thinks she's going to be happy when she gets what she wants, right? But ultimately, she's not getting a unified marriage because he's driven out of it. So there has to be. And so again, the flip side is, wow, if, in terms of the submission aspect, if dad really thinks strongly about something, maybe I need to listen. Maybe I do need to consider, and maybe I need to not always use my wiles. Because again, women, we do have in a sense, a great power over our husband, but if it means he's actually just checking out because he doesn't want to deal with all the complaining and the grumbling, whether it be of the teenage daughters or the sons or the wife, right? Then that's a dangerous dynamic when he's no longer willing to take that risk.
Right. Now, what if the husband is just not a good giver? What does the wife do then?
Yeah. And I think, again, when you're trying to motivate someone to give, right? I think probably the least effective way to motivate someone to give is to sort of critique and complain and be really harsh. And the reason I say that is because if a man really does identify with his deeds, with his work, with his actions, when we criticize those actions, he is going to feel it in a way that cuts at his identity. Okay, we don't know. Women don't always get this. We don't always get that, like, and I notice it with my sons. I have 4 sons. I notice it like, oh, they do seem to respond to criticism of their work, what they've done, in a particularly sensitive way because they've identified with it in a way that we girls don't always do. It's not that we enjoy criticism or something, but we again can make that distinction between what I did and who I am. And so I don't think harsh criticism is ever going to be the way. But I do think communication, healthy communication, which is so much easier said than done, but we have to find, men are usually motivated through affirmation. We do have to find something to praise, something to thank him for, right? You don't just start with complaining, because when you receive something well, ideally they're going to think, oh, she liked that. I liked her response to that. I'm going to do that again, right? So we want to find something to praise because, again, there's, no one is wholly bad, right? We're trying to affirm what they do and encourage in that way. But I also talk in the book about, having those frank conversations about what I need, and that's humbling because many women, we do want our husbands to guess what we need or to remember. And sometimes they forget and we're like, well, I told you I like chocolate ice cream, and they just don't ever remember that or something like that, right? But when we are talking to them, again, we have to prioritize what we really do, what we need most, right? Because it is possible sometimes with women to communicate all of our needs at once, all of our needs at the same time. And the way, and again, I cite studies from psychologists. The male brain is actually different than the female brain. And most men tend to sort of deal with one problem at a time. And so they're looking to kind of triage our problems when we tell them things. And they don't always know what to prioritize. So we ourselves, I think, have to reflect and try to figure out a way. And again, there's nothing I think more frustrating for a guy to hear than if he says, well, what's wrong, honey? And she says, well, if you can't figure it out, I'm not going to tell you. That sort of famous line. That's not going to end well for anybody. So, for wives, sometimes being humble enough to just say, what I need and what makes me happy. But we do have to think about the way in which we deliver it and the context in which we deliver it to try to prioritize and try to find something to praise, something to thank him for, something to be happy about. Because he does, when he makes you happy, that's what makes him feel loved. When you receive well what he does, that's going to make him feel loved. So it sort of needs to be in that context. And sometimes it can be agonizing, but for most of us, it's usually somewhere in the middle.
I want to propose a theory and see what you think of it. In Ephesians 5, Paul gives Christ's relationship with the church as the paradigm for marriage, and implicitly, explicitly referring to Christ's sacrifice of his body, laying down his life, I should say, for his body, the church. I think that second to that, the best concrete example we get of how relations between man and woman in marriage should look like is between Jesus and Mary at the wedding at Cana, even though they were not husband and wife, obviously. Yeah. But and that may seem like a strange claim for that reason. They weren't married, but this is an interaction between the only perfect man and the only perfect woman who ever lived, and it's at a wedding. And some people would argue that that's when Jesus instituted marriage, although we aren't sure exactly when that sacrament was instituted. And so I think it'd be crazy not to look at that interaction that they have at this wedding feast as not teaching us something, not only about their specific and unique relationship, which it obviously tells us a great deal about, Mariology, for instance, but about relationship between men and women, and particularly husbands and wives. And I think it tells us a lot about what mutual submission, the phrase that John Paul II used, because I don't think that's a new idea with John Paul II. I think that Pius XII, in his allocution on the subject of authority and submission in marriage, lays out something that looks an awful lot like mutual submission, but probably actually just it's more clear than John Paul II was about how that fits with the whole tradition of the church. Yeah. But anyway, so the wedding at Cana, Mary tells Jesus they have no wine. And she doesn't even ask him to do anything, but there's clearly an implied request there, right? She lays out the problem for him. She does not command him. She does not tell him what to do. And he says, "Woman, what have you to do with me, or what has this to do with me?" I don't know if anybody knows exactly what that means, but one way it could possibly be taken is, this just sort of referring us to the fact that he's not obligated to do this, under obedience to his mother. And he says, "My hour has not yet come," indicating that to do this would involve a sacrifice of bringing about the course of events leading to his passion. Now, and also, of course, his hour also referring to his glorification, his revelation of being, the Son of God by performing miracles. But after that, she says, "Do whatever he tells you." So what's interesting to me is so he does it. She doesn't ask him, but he does it. And I see it as being a good example of how this sort of mutual submission works, because basically he is treating it's a your wish is my command kind of thing. He wasn't commanded, he wasn't given a command, but he's treating a wish as though it were a command. And it is in this sense that there is a mutual submission. And an obedience to the needs of the wife, so to speak, the husband submitting himself to that, even though it's maybe not obedience in the sort of normal, strict, literal sense of that word. Yeah. And then what she ends by doing is referring everybody back to his authority. And particularly, you could say, the children analogously in that situation. Yes. She is referring everything back to his authority after he has sort of submitted himself. So I don't know. Yes. I think that tells us a lot about what, this relationship and mutual submission would actually look like.
Yeah, I love that. And what I love two other little aspects that, number one, Mary is her feminine sensitivity of noticing. She is concerned that the bride and the groom are going to be embarrassed, right? That we've run out of wine. She's really concerned about others and their needs and their feelings. She's concerned about that. And then, of course, yes, she brings it to Jesus. And then to say, do whatever he tells you, it's an expression of trust in him, because she is not dictating exactly what he should do, but she is making clear something that her own feminine intuition has zeroed in on. And she is communicating
Right.
that. And that's the thing. Husbands do need to trust their wives' intuition, especially about their kids. They have a super sense about it. And it doesn't mean that a dad doesn't have any sense or that a wife couldn't be wrong, but we got to listen, right? But she's presenting her need, right? And she didn't just present a whole bunch of needs, and she presents an important need. But then to say, do whatever he tells you, expresses utter trust. Do something about it. And then she's going to live with the consequences of whatever he decides to do, because she didn't dictate. She's like, listen, here is this problem. I trust you to solve it. I trust you to do something about it. And that's, again, like, do something. Sometimes we women want to go and do everything. The hardest thing about being a woman sometimes is sitting around waiting for him to do something. It's hard, but then we don't always like what he does, right? So her expression of trust in him to do it. And the way you put it, that your wish is my command, again and again, I talk about in the book that what ultimately makes a man happy is to be well received. If what he does is well received, if it makes his wife happy, he feels good and affirmed. So actually what's going to make a husband most happy is when she's happy. So he wants nothing more than to make her happy. So yes, part of that mutual submission is, okay, it's my job to do things to make her happy, right? And it's her part to receive those things well and in the spirit in which they're given, even when, of course, they're not always perfect, or maybe they're not always what she imagined. So I think that's a tremendous biblical example to really talk about that. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Yeah. And that's such a great point about her trust. I totally agree with that. You talked about how the family is made possible by both the sameness and the difference of men and women. And that's something I'll leave people to read the book to get more on. What I wanted to ask specifically is, how do you think that men and women can learn from each other's way of loving, given that there is a universal human nature here, even though they operate on under different modes? Ultimately, we do both need to learn how to exercise authority in certain circumstances. We need to learn how to give, and we need to learn how to submit and to receive. So what are some ways in which men and women could learn from each other in that circumstances, sort of with the assumption that one purpose of marriage is to bring men and women in close enough contact with each other and daily association for years that they actually do learn from each other's modes of being?
Yes. It's funny, even just, I hate to use a personal example, but even in my own life, last fall, my husband had a sabbatical. And so I took a second class at Christendom to teach. And that meant, for the first time in, I think, 16 years, I really needed my husband to actually step in and do some of the homeschooling with the kids at home. And really, up until that point, we kind of separated our duties. I handled that, and he taught college and I taught all the kids at home. And it was really neat because we actually got the chance to kind of walk in each other's shoes a little bit. And he really had to enter in and engage. And we had some great discussions about things he noticed about the kids, and he noticed challenges that I had that he never even realized. And I noticed the same thing. And I realized some of the headaches or things that I was dealing with teaching classes. I realized, oh, he's been doing this for, 22 years and he doesn't even complain about it. It was just it was really good for us to kind of walk in each other's shoes a bit. And that was just a personal privilege that we sort of had. But I do think that in terms of loving, one of the things that I mention in the book is that the fact that women can kind of distinguish the person from their deeds, that we can distinguish a person from their successes or failures, which is a little harder for a man to do, that does help reveal to a man how God loves him. St. John Paul has a beautiful quote, and I'm probably going to massacre it here, but it's basically something to the effect of, we are not the sum of our successes and failures, but we are the sum of the Father's love for us. That really what gives us our worth and our value is that we are loved by God, even if the things that we try to do fail or don't pan out or succeed. And so we as women can help our husbands to really just to to let go in that way. Actually, we have to help them to, quote, be receivers, right? Because before God, we have to be in that receptive mode, right? We are, and that takes a lot of humility and vulnerability. We can help them with that. And I think from the male to the female side, again, one danger for us women is that in identifying more with our body than with our works, sometimes we can get caught up in physical appearance. We can get down on our physical appearance. We can get obsessed with exercise and superficial things, whereas, the masculine outlook that says, hey, no, it's not about what you look like, it's about what you do. Again, that's to have hobbies, to have artistic outlets, to have work in our life can actually remind us that we're not just this body, right? It expands our sense of spiritual identity by having something to sort of take pride in, having something to say, oh, I did that. And again, it doesn't have to be paid work. It can be a hobby. It can be charity. It can be something artistic. It can be something musical. It's something else. We have to have something that we do. And again, right. Many times, okay, different points in your life, it's your home life and your kids, but you better get some other things because they are going to grow up and you need other things. So I think that it can help both of our senses of identity to kind of see how the others work and see what makes them happy and what makes them tick, and that can actually help both sexes.
I wanted to touch quickly on the penultimate chapter of the book, which I think if any chapter is going to perhaps rile up some of the people who might already agree with you on most of the rest of the book, it would be that, because you go into how this dynamic of gift and receptivity can be lived out in modern situations where the husband and wife determine that it might be better for the family for the wife to work outside the home, or even for the wife to be the primary breadwinner for the family and have the husband stay home and watch the kids. And without getting like too mired into the details of that, and referring specifically to that latter situation, the rare situation where they might discern that it's better for the wife to be the primary breadwinner, at least for a significant period of time, and the husband stay home with the kids. You talk about sort of the ways that gift and receptivity between the husband and the wife, respectively, can be lived out even in that situation. But I'm curious what you think, how you'd respond to this. My observation that my experience reading that and the amount that you talk about the way that like sort of almost countermeasures need to be taken to preserve that gift and receptivity dynamic in such a situation. The impression I got reading it was more that like, boy, this is just a really undesirable situation. Like maybe there are some situations in which that's best for a certain amount of time, especially if the husband is, just out of work or invalid or something like that. But it's like you were bending over backwards to sort of like see how that spiritual dynamic can play out in such a situation. But at the same time, just even thinking about it gives the impression that this is really better to be avoided if possible. Is that something you had in mind consciously when writing that section, or were you just sort of going for the limit with that?
That's a good question. The truth is, and in my first draft of the book, I kind of touched on it. And my editor said, the truth is, we really want you to expand on that because there are so many people in that situation. What do you have to say to that situation? So I had to kind of dig deep and really try to, I hope, give it the best treatment that I could. Because again,
right.
even that very discernment that we're going to have an arrangement that's, maybe non-traditional, right? That decision in itself needs to be ultimately made by the head of the family. And I do talk about that so that we're assuming that he is assessing, he and she together, of course, but that this really is best. And I will say this. Yes, I probably did bend over backwards because I don't think that should be handled lightly. But nonetheless, if you're going to have a non-traditional situation, you got to make sure this marriage is rock solid. And so trying to really kind of dig deep and look at the ways in which we make sure that we can really affirm one another according to the natural modes of affirmation. I just felt like I kind of needed to do that rather than just kind of say, well, they can figure it out. Because I do think that, we have to put a lot into it. But one reason I think that I am grateful that they asked me to write this chapter was because, again, so many young people today that are getting married, so many of them are growing up in homes where they don't necessarily have the model of a unified marriage. I mean, look at the statistics. They're
right.
And so that is going to be one huge way in which a woman and a man feel the confidence to sort of step into these more traditional roles. And if they're not there, it can be actually a lot harder. And I know, of women who really, really struggle and are afraid of sort of being the stay-at-home mom because they didn't have it modeled well. They have many scars and wounds, and they're scared. And they have a certain confidence in the job that they have been doing, the career that they have prepared for, or whatever. That doesn't mean we can't stretch ourselves, and it doesn't mean we can't decide, but these kids actually really need me right now. I got to just do it. Depends on the situation, of course. And that's, again, part of the headship role there is not just assessing how the wife is feeling, but how are the kids doing in this situation. So I think that it's difficult. I think what the family needs to flourish is the presence, frankly, of both parents, right? I mean, there was a time in earlier cultures where fathers didn't go somewhere to work. They weren't traveling 6 days a week. They were somewhere on the property. And it doesn't mean you spent all day with dad, but certainly sons could learn things with their dads and from their dads in ways that you actually have to make intentional efforts to do now. Hey, if you travel all the time, maybe, one weekend you should, I don't know, maybe make a table with your boys. And we actually have to make more intentional efforts to do things that used to happen more naturally. So I think it goes both ways in terms of the culture and what it's done to the family. And
I agree with that. And that idea of a father closer to the domestic setting is very appealing to me as well. And by the way, to be clear, I think it's good that you wrote this chapter as detailed as you did, because there are people who are in that situation through genuine need and need that guidance. But at the same time, I think it's kind of cool the way the chapter turned out, because in our age, especially in matters like this, everybody in and outside of the church wants to take the exception or the edge case and use it to
make the rule,
to disintegrate the rule. And the way that you discussed it, dealing with all of the potential difficulties in such a scenario, really, it kind of counteracts that tendency, because it makes people see, well, do I really want this that badly? That sounds like it might be more trouble than it's worth, frankly, unless it's truly necessary.
Because it's going to take a lot of work.
Or this might be, we might want to make this arrangement as temporary as possible.
Exactly.
Because So the way that you wrote it, it doesn't do that thing that people do where they make it sound like, well, one sort of situation is going to be as common as the other.
Yeah. And I think ultimately too, something that Edith Stein, St. Teresa Benedicta, she in one of her essays was talking about basically all of the gifts that women have that they can bring to the world at large, and how the professional world, the public world, they need a woman's touch, so to speak. They need a woman's attention to the concrete and to the person, and we can be a great leaven and counterbalance, and all these things. So women can do anything, but what that also means, and what she also stresses, and what I like to stress, is just because we notice that the woman's gifts, her maternal gifts, they help the world at large. They were designed for the family. And if anything in the world needs a woman's touch, it's the family. And somehow we lost that. And we think as a culture, women can do anything. And somehow we just kind of leave the family in the dust. Women's gifts are especially needed in the family. But again, because in a particular way, because so many women have been deprived of that in their own home. A lot of them don't have the confidence, and there's a whole host of issues aside from just economic issues that I tried to take into account. And I hope that the chapter is well received, and that at least there was an attempt on my part to have a great sensitivity and not to try to alienate people. And really, encouraging people to have good marriages is an incredible gift that you can give to your family, and it will give an incredible stability to their children, if you can pull it off. So.
Right. Just as a wrap up, do you think you could bring it back quickly to the topic of obedience and the human person, and how this all ultimately relates to our relationship with God?
I think, in a sense, wrapping it up in this way, ultimately, right, our reception of God's overtures, right? God is offering himself to us in relationship, in communion. And when we say yes, we have this term, doing God's will. I don't mean to put that down, but we say doing God's will. What does it really mean to say I'm doing God's will? Well, this means God has something he wants me to do. It's his will. He wants me to do something. If I accept that and I say, okay, God, I want what you want for me. I want what you want for me. It's like Jesus in the Garden of Olives. Not my will, but thy will be done. I want what you want for me. And when we can say that, that is what creates the unity. That's the unity within the Godhead right there. And so when we say that, how do we say that? We say that through the circumstances of our particular vocation. So that means even if I'm married to somebody who's not always getting it right, maybe he's not a really good giver, and I'm struggling and I'm trying as best as I can to affirm what he does do, trying to communicate well, and trying to be strong and do it in the best spirit that I can. If you're in the religious life, if you're in the single life, whatever the circumstances of your day, if you are embracing them and enduring the pain, because again, there is a lot of suffering in everyone's lives, some more than others, but if we sort of, if we can relativize a little bit and put all of our human relationships in the overarching context of our relationship with God, if it is God's will, this is my vocation in life, and I'm going to try to say yes every day to God's will as communicated to me in and through this vocation, then even when it's a valley of tears, and even when some things are bitter, a bitter pill to swallow here and there, if we can do it, ultimately, we are saying yes to God in and through that vocation. And so we are actually freely embracing God, whose will is presented to us in the circumstances of our daily life. And so that to me really is it's totally free. It's totally free on our part. We are freely embracing things, even crosses, right? But it's our yes. It's our grateful yes to what God is offering us. And so that divine intimacy that's going to be brought about through that. I mean, that's what brings about intimacy between persons, is saying, yes, I want this for you and I accept this. So again, but all of our human relationships are going to disappoint us in some way. There's always going to be friction. It's never going to be perfect. And so the only perfect one is going to be with God. And so that means that if we can sort of, if we can relate to God in and through those circumstances, that our obedience, and that, again, as I mentioned in the last chapter of the book, that puts a husband's headship also in the context of obedience, because he's ultimately obeying God by being the head, right? He is obeying God, doing his will by taking the risk and being the leader for this family, even if it means that he's not always appreciated, that he falls on his face, that he has to do stuff he doesn't feel like doing, right? All of those challenges that we associate with the headship, that too is a form of obedience, because he is receiving God's will for him and saying yes. So that both, and that's kind of brings back to that mutual submission. Man and wife are both living obedience in and through the specifics of this vocation. And the better that each one is able to live it, the more joyful this earthly life is going to be. But even if it's not wasted. Your efforts to live your vocation to the best of your ability, even if the other person maybe isn't doing so well, it's still ultimately going to bring about that union.
Great. Mary, thank you so much for writing this book, and thank you for coming back on the show. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Oh, well, thank you for having me and for, making this whole thing get started. I'm so grateful, and for your whole support for the whole project.
It's my honor. So everybody, I urge you to pick up The Obedience Paradox, Finding True Freedom in Marriage. You can also listen to my previous interview with Mary in episode 48, although I think we covered a lot of that same ground here, but in greater detail and greater depth. I also want to mention too, I mentioned Allocutions to Newlyweds by Pope Pius XII a couple times. CatholicCulture.org is actually in the process of getting those scanned and uploaded to our website, because they're not available. They're not on the Vatican website. They're available in a translation from I forget when, 70s or 80s, that is only available from like an SSPX bookstore reprint or something. So this is public domain now. So just so people can find it online.
Fantastic.
And also won't have to buy books from the SSPX. We're putting it on our website. So hopefully by the end of the year that should be up there. And I'll add the link to this video and page for people to be able to find that easily. But hopefully we should be able to have all of those on there, including the one specifically dealing with authority and submission. And I haven't read all of them yet, but it seems like it's almost like a preconciliar, like a prototype for the theology of the body, not in this philosophical sense, but that it's this series of addresses given to newlyweds that really covers all the aspects of marriage in a systematic way. Not that it's dealing with this sort of same theological method or anything like that. It's much more just sort of straight down the line in the tradition and common sense and pastoral experience. But I definitely recommend people check those out as well. Thanks everybody for listening, and please subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, and we'll see you next time.